and it's lovely to be back in a Values Alliance kind of meetup. And great subject. This is, I hope we can really explore volunteering. I'm sure that all of us have got experience of volunteering in one way or another, and there are many facets to it. I'm going to kind of draw on sort of time and insights and research that I've seen that particularly tie up volunteering and values, but it's going to be really helpful to get your take and input on those as we go. So I have got some slides which, in Blue Peter style, if that reference makes sense to you, I've prepared earlier. So I will go through those, and that'll help me give some structure to you in terms of what we're looking at. But of course, please, this is a small group. Don't hesitate to kind of jump in with, your comments and questions. There is space afterwards, as Charles said, but, don't hold back if you see a point or want to kind of add or amplify something, because I'm sure that everyone would be grateful to you for doing that. And of course, because we're talking about the value of volunteering, we should start with some thanks, I think, particularly to Charles and Neil and Alan on this call, and Maddie too, for being the kind of orchestrating volunteer group behind the Values Alliance. To those of us who are members, of course, it all works beautifully and smoothly, and then the world stops to listen when we get to World Values Day. But like the proverbial swan, or the literal swan, if you like, there's a lot of work that goes on underneath the water. And, I'm as a member very grateful to each of the four of you, as well as others who've played that role over time. So I'm going to share screen the value of volunteering to dive now into these. I've put a copy of a photo of my book up there. Like many members of the UK Values Alliance, I've written a book on values. I don't think it's better than many others, but it has the merit of being shorter and focuses really on organisational values. And just to tell you a little bit about my self at the present, is that my volunteer role, primary volunteer role, I've got a number, is as chair of an inspiring community land trust. So this is a community housing project in South London, in Lewisham. And the story of this is a story of patient and persistent volunteering, dreamers and troublemakers. And it started with a young man called Kareem, whose parents had been volunteers themselves, and volunteers in the sense of building their own house, which is an unusual and extreme form of volunteering. But they built their own house as part of a self-build project in Lewisham, in a street called Walter's Way, named after the pioneering architect Walter Seagull. And Kareem, as an adult, wanted to build his own house and was interested in self-build. And with others had identified that there was an area of derelict land in the centre of Lewisham that used to be a school, and said, well, why can't we build housing on this land? And that's a simple question, but many simple questions take a long time to answer, and perhaps the answers are complex. And Russ, which has the short name, that's rather hippie, longer name, Adrian, you'll have seen many imaginative names for societies, and Russ probably is up there. It's the Rural Urban Synthesis Society, but essentially formed as a society to build permanently affordable housing, a community in a sense on this site. And that work was completed a couple of years ago, and it's a very beautiful and inspiring place, and a very beautiful and inspiring place for visitors to come in as well, with children kind of playing quite safely on different levels, and a real sense that this is an inclusive place for people to live. So that's my current role, and this is a volunteer-led organization. It is a business, but not with enough money to get things done by paying everybody. So you pay where you have to, and the rest really is done through and by volunteers. So that's a little bit of me. And I want to, and I will send these slides over to Charles, I guess, if anybody wants access to this. So please don't feel that you are going to be tested on this. Although, Alan, I might test you. It might, just because you got such a big brain. But this is a model of the economy that was developed by my brilliant late friend, Hazel Henderson. Hazel was one of the most important radical economists of the last 40 years. She grew up in Bristol and then moved to Florida, and was an active writer and volunteer herself. But the way that she conceives the economy is that what we think of as the economy, which is typically the market, where money changes hands in the private sector, is actually just the icing on the cake. And the different layers of the cake rest on each other. And in particular, all of the part of the economy that would be measured in some monetary sense, private sector, public sector, rests on a cooperative economy, or a love economy, she will also call of it, which is of voluntary action, parenting, volunteering, mutual aid in that way. And in turn, of course, that love economy rests on nature and the functions of nature as well. And it's just a very simple reminder of the fundamental importance of voluntary action, that this is not a complement to the market. It's not on the margins of the economy or the market. It's actually the resting place, the bedrock on which everything else will build. So you will see in a kind of, very sort of typical way, estimates of the financial value of volunteering. And I think those estimates are that in England alone, the value of formal volunteering, and volunteering tends to be talked about as formal or informal. Formal is where you've got an organization, a volunteer role, that it's recognized in some way. Informal volunteering is what Neil does to help out with his neighbours and the community, or Charles may do if he's, a kind of a member of a faith group or the like. So just for formal volunteering, the economic value, the financial value rather, in England is estimated at £24.7 billion. Now, of course, that sounds hugely impressive, but as members of the UK Values Alliance, I would expect you to be challenging that, saying, well, look, actually, if the way that you show the value of volunteering is to put it in financial terms, you're already marginalizing it, because the value, the business case, if you like, for volunteering is not money. It is love and care and all of these positive outcomes that you will see. And it's worth holding on to that, because there are pressures within society to monetize everything, to financialize everything. And volunteering's not immune from that. But there is so much more of a richness to the motivation involved in volunteering, where you are caring for someone else, where it is rooted in your values, than could possibly be captured in a financial exchange or transaction of that way. So volunteering holds the world up. I thought I ought to give you some data on who the volunteers are. And this is data that is, we've seen changes, in short, over the last decade, not least as a result of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic was an extraordinary chapter of volunteering that actually the UK and other countries prove themselves to be nations of volunteers because of the number of people that stepped up through mutual aid or support for others. But a lot of that was informal volunteering, and what we did see was a downturn in the level of formal volunteering, and that downturn remains. So there's been a secular decline in volunteering. And it's interesting to reflect why that is. I'd be interested in your thoughts. It would be easy to jump to cost of living, time pressures, reduced funding for voluntary organisations that mean that they don't have the infrastructure capacity to then support more volunteers. But possibly it's a question as to whether we as a society value volunteering enough, whether we give it the recognition and the status in our own lives, but in the lives of others. So the decline of formal volunteering, I think, is something of a canary in the coal mine, if that's the right metaphor, for the state of society more widely. But in brief, the bullet points here are that, particularly from formal volunteering, older people will remain the most common. Around 1 in 4 of us, I'm not quite that age group, but around 1 in 4 of us participate at least once a month in formal volunteering. And that was the group that stepped back, partly for safeguarding reasons, more during the pandemic, which is partly behind the figures that I talked about. There is volunteering across every segment of the population, and in particular, kind of a growth in informal volunteering. And what's exciting about that with younger people coming through is it's redefining the nature of volunteering. Quite a lot of volunteering is quite crusty, if I hope that's not controversial, to suggest that. And if you look at the volunteering charities, they're quite traditional. And, they've made some efforts to try and recognize, wider forms of volunteering, citizen action, campaigning, and the like, but still quite traditional in the way that volunteering is perceived. But younger people coming through with their own ways of expressing and living out volunteering. So one example of that is micro volunteering, which is an interest in people being able to pick up and volunteer for short periods of time as and when they choose to, as and when it's convenient to, rather than assuming that you're going to turn up in the charity shop at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday and do a full day or the like. And there's been a real innovation and explosion of different platforms and models for harnessing that form of kind of micro volunteering. In the tech sector, for example, pro bono kind of organizations that make it easy online to sign up to do an hour if you've got technology skills, an hour of technology support for charities. Beautiful, beautiful and simple model. And I think I just brought in this point about diversity. There is, again, volunteering right across society. The first credit unions, for example, in the UK, of which there are now so many with so many members, started with kind of families coming in from the Caribbean, Windrush and beyond, who were used to the idea of financial cooperatives and found themselves not particularly welcome in British banks, so formed their own financial cooperatives. Kind of first one actually in 1964 in Wimbledon, at least in a GB context. But the disability side, again, it's easy to think that that the barriers to volunteering may be too high, but people with disabilities are just as likely to volunteer formally as others, and more likely to volunteer informally. So a little bit there. There's some research as well on people's mindsets, why people volunteer and the different profiles that people bring with it. But I thought I wouldn't overload you. But here is one short slide on why people volunteer, what their motivations are. And I love this research. I love it, love it, love it, love it. And it was research that was done, very obscure, I have to say, very academic, but very brilliant, by another late friend of mine, you can see a connection here, called Johnston Birchall. Used to be professor of Stirling, and with Richard Simmons. And Richard and Johnston were looking at volunteering in the public sector. And there's a huge set of examples of people that volunteer. The NHS, we kind of tend to think about as, as doctors and hospital trusts and the like. But there's always been a huge story of volunteering right from the very start. Hospital friends and volunteers playing that role, raising money for kidney machines or the like. So there's huge amounts of volunteering right across the kind of public sector. And in this research, Johnston and Richard looked at what motivates people to volunteer. And, broadly, community pride, that's a term for a lot of different subsections come in it. Altruism, where there's a personal connection as well as sort of social cohesion. And what Johnston and Richard did, which was beautiful, was that they developed this by looking at the different motivations, they called them incentives, to volunteer, and characterized them between those that were more individual incentives. So, for example, I want to get something right. I want to get something put right, so I'm going to volunteer to help improve the service to do it. Or people looking to get out and to do something that is going to, use their time and give them social connections. Those individual values and incentives. And then the more pro-social incentives that are about giving back and the collective good and identifying, with the public interest more at large. And broadly what they found was that typically more people start volunteering because of individual incentives, but the longer they volunteer, the more that the collective incentives win out. Now, okay, what does that mean? What it means is that volunteering grows citizens. The more we volunteer, the more public-spirited and citizen-like we are and we become. And I think that's quite profound, because there is this interplay in terms of values between the institutional structures that we inhabit and our own individual values. And when you're operating within a market context, with the logic of commercial exchange, you start to behave more like a consumer. In the logic of a nexus of values that is a pro-social, we start to behave in ways that give more emphasis on those universal values within the kind of Schwartz multiplex that is there. And Jane Jacobs, the late Jane Jacobs, not a friend of mine, but the great Jane Jacobs, who wrote about urban planning and the like, wrote a brilliant book about the idea that there are these two syndromes in society. She wrote it as a Socratic dialogue, so it's not an easy read, but one of those is the commercial syndrome, a connection set of values that drive those, and the second is essentially what she called the guardian syndrome. Now, let me jump kind of on. Values. This will be well known to you as members of the UK Value Alliance. I'm sure that there is difference between intrinsic and extrinsic values. Intrinsic are things, well, that we use. I wonder if I've got a, no, I haven't got a slide there. Intrinsic ones that we use because they are a value in themselves. Extrinsic values that can head on the right is about they're of value because of your relationship with others. And I always say not all values are ethical values. People behave and they follow their values, but greed can be a value. Domination can be a value as well. But the intrinsic values do tend to be more positive. And done well, where there is an alignment of values, it's the most powerful organizational model. It is just extraordinary to watch. Charles mentioned the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was many years ago now, but a petition I launched because it was before the digital era is the Guinness World Record in terms of the number of hand-signed signatures on the petition. I think something like 24 million around the world. And that was an extraordinary campaign that people came together to challenge the rich countries to end the scandal of the unpayable debts of the very poorest countries, who were spending more on servicing their financial debts than they were on the health and education of their children. And it was a real sense that the campaign was tapping into this much larger constituency for social justice than would be the case of just the members of Oxfam or a church or the like. Alignment is all very well and it's very powerful. Again, Adrian, you're an experienced cooperative business development advisor. At its best, you'll have seen co-ops aligned and going in a single direction. And at their worst, it's the worst kind of organizational model because you have conflict and everybody feels entitled for their view to win out. And actually, this is where, in a financial or a market context, you can at least tell people to shut up or stop paying them. In a volunteer context, it's actually much harder. And we need to talk more, I think, about conflict as values practitioners, because, of course, tension is always inevitable in any organizational situation, but that tension doesn't have to spill over into conflict. And understanding how to communicate across different values, or to defuse tensions or build the skills of cooperation is an important element. And I've seen that. Now, this is what I call the values fit. And this is about whether your organizational values fit your external circumstances. So they take you forward as an organization. Plenty of founding values that become nostalgic and not fit for purpose. So, values need to sit and be fit within their environment, but equally internally as well. And the difference between shared and coherent values that can really take an organization forward and ones where they are not shared or incoherent, which is where you get conflict or confusion. And I have been doing a review of a controversial set of elections last year to the board of a cooperative called the Dons Trust. This is AFC Wimbledon, which is an absolutely inspiring volunteer story. That this is the ground, a photograph I took a month or two back. And the story of Wimbledon, which you may know, is that the owner, Sam Hammam, wanted to move the club out of Plough Lane in Wimbledon and move it to Milton Keynes so that he could sell the land to build houses on. And so Wimbledon, the original football club, moved to Milton Keynes and became the MK Dons. The fans of Wimbledon said, no, we're going to start our own club, AFC Wimbledon. And they started from the very bottom, the bottom. I don't know what that is. Football fans will probably know what it is. Alan, do you know what the very bottom is?
No, Ed, it's regional leagues, I'm imagining.
Shocked to hear that you don't know, but very obscure, so obscure that Alan hasn't heard of it. And they fought their way up. They built their way through those leagues, and they are now in League One, in mid-table glory. They're higher, I think, than MK Dons. So they've made it all the way through. They have 7,000 members, 7,000 volunteer members, fans. And this ground is now beautifully back on Plough Lane after years of being as close to Wimbledon as they could get. They finally were able to bid for the former motocross, greyhound racing site, and with support from the local authority. And this ground is funded entirely through member finance, member capital. So absolutely volunteer money. Some in the form of equity, community shares, some in the form of bonds from members as well, around £10 million. So it is an extraordinary story. But the elections that I've been asked to come in to have a look at as a neutral observer, I'm not an AFC Wimbledon fan, I'm a Charlton Athletic fan, so it's good of them to bring me in, was to deal with conflict in the club and different cliques and groups that played out in a very controversial election. And I've been asked to do an independent review of that, which I hope will be published next month. And dealing with conflict and understanding the cultural issues is at the heart of this. And at Pilotlight, and I'll be brief around this, and Charles talked a little bit about the work of Pilotlight. I think what was interesting as a charity that was enabling volunteering was that it was bringing together volunteers essentially from two very different worlds. The first world was the world of business, and the second was the world of charities. And these are the values that Pilotlight has long had, and they're great values for an organisation that wants to bridge between radically different constituencies, but to treat them as equals and to leave them with a kind of mutual value coming out of it. Because in a lot of pro bono work or skill volunteering, the expert is the expert. They're coming in with professional skills. They hold the power. They hold the status. The role of the charity is simply to be grateful. And to shift that to a more equal mutual exchange requires the right set of values to do that. And, Pilotlight is a lovely example of where the values have been completely consistent over time, while the form of the organization has morphed in an entrepreneurial way as the opportunities have changed. We bring people together, we believe in potential, and we expect the best. Now, you'll be used to value statements. I won't linger on this, but as you can imagine, this was embedded right through in terms of performance reviews and public reporting and the like. Again, not a slide to be tested on, but the theory of change, which is the tool that charities use to try and understand their impact. This maps the impacts, and each of these can then be measured. Looked at this bringing together these different groups. So, for example, women from the BlackRock Women's Network, extraordinarily impressive, brilliant people who have grown up, though, through a financial services industry. And so the stuff they know and the stuff they don't know. And then working with charities like Crasac, which is the Leeds based women's refuge, on addressing, their work and needs as an organization, was a real two-way process of both learning from each other, where the volunteers were coming in with incredible technical skills, but they were leaving with greater interpersonal skills through the process. So this idea that volunteering can be enriching, that there's a value there of volunteering as a form of learning and a form of learning and development. And what we were doing at Pilotlight, which continues under my successor, Lisa, is essentially selling in volunteering to commercial companies like Sodexo or Morgan Stanley, not simply on the basis of philanthropy and doing good for society, but on the basis of the learning and development of their staff, where there is a clear financial return on investment for what is made. So those have been my thoughts going through, and just kind of summarize those. Volunteering holds the world up. Informal or formal, it's an enduring practice across all society. Volunteering grows citizens, encouraging pro-social behavior. Volunteering can be rooted in intrinsic or extrinsic values, and where values are aligned, the results are extraordinary. And where they clash, values tensions can turn to conflict. There's a need to think about the values fit, to be reflective, intentional, critical, if need be, around values in terms of the wider world and where the world is moving. There can be issues around handling performance in a volunteer-led culture. The phrase that I used in my report for the Don's Trust is the title of an old NCVO book, which I love, which is Voluntary but Not Amateur, which is the idea that you can value volunteering, but actually you also value quality. And just because somebody turns up to volunteer isn't enough. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done well. So accountability within that framework. Skills-based volunteering is an example of bridging divides, and we have more and more divides in the world. The more divided we are, to some extent, the less people will be likely to step forward to volunteer for universal values. But volunteering that can bridge those divisions, I think, becomes all the more precious in our toolkit. And volunteering is proving itself as well as enriching and rewarding as a way to learn. And maybe just to close on that, for me, going back to my kind of time at Russ as chair, we've been involving 400 people locally as volunteers to try and co-design an option and a future for another derelict site. This is the Ladywell Play Tower. Alan, you may know it. In Lewisham, it's a scandal that it's been left to go to rack and ruin. It's an old swimming baths. It's a grade 2 heritage listed asset at risk. And we want to take it over as a community-owned asset and to put a bid in for the council to do that. And we've been using a great participatory tool, Planning for Real, the model on the right, to get people's input so that we know the ideas that we're bringing forward for this asset are ones that will be rooted in the values and the vision of the community at kind of large. So with that, I'll pass back to Alan and to Neil.
Gosh, well, the first thing is to thank Ed for that uh, great synopsis at the end, but also for his personal take on his own involvement and also the research he alluded to. The next stage today really is to ask Ed any questions that we have following his talk with us today. So can I open that up for anyone who would specifically like to ask Ed a question whilst he is here with us today?
Can I kick off by
Yeah.
just asking a question, which I'm sure others would ask if I didn't step forward anyway. But Ed, that was fantastic. There's some really, really exciting data there. The information about volunteering, how many people volunteer, what percentage of different age groups, and so on for formal and informal volunteering. Just on which it is fascinating itself, but just what I wondered was, and maybe I missed it somewhere in your talk as you went through that bit, but informal. How is informal volunteering defined? Because this is very interesting for us because we've been trying to define it this year. You know, our theme for World Values Day this year is values and volunteering, and we've framed volunteering to explicitly include. You know, we don't want to put people off and think it's just formal volunteering. So we said that includes informal volunteering, which is basically doing something kind, thoughtful, or whatever for other people without expectation of reward or incentive or whatever. Is it when in compiling those figures, do you know what the definition was? Is it as absolutely as broad as that, which obviously would cover, you know, helping the proverbial old lady across the street or whatever? Is it as broad as that, or is there some sort of more I know, rigorous or tighter definition?
Thank you. I mean, that definition sounds good to me. I don't know what the definition is, but I do know that it's established enough that there will be a kind of a rigor behind it. And there's digested statistics on volunteering in the UK is a regular report published by the National Council for Voluntary Organisations called Time Well Spent. And that will be kind of a or the place. Now, it may be that informal volunteering is characterized as a bundle of tasks. And if you, such as your example, helping someone across the road, or, you know, being, you know, an active member, contributing member of a faith group or the like. So it may be that it's constructed in that way. I actually don't know, but, you know, could easily take a look, or that report would be a place to go. I don't know, Ruth, you got your hand up. Have you got anything to add on this?
So I have the Community Life Survey
Yep.
defines formal as volunteering through organisations like clubs or charities, and informal as volunteering arranged by volunteers themselves. I would say that
it's wonderfully circular, isn't it?
I'm a volunteer involvement professional, so I'm quite interested in this, and I'd love to be involved in some of the conversation for the World Day. And just to plug my book, I've written a book on volunteering, and what we decided in our book was not to concentrate on the definitions, volunteer, formal or informal, because it was all volunteering, and almost say that as a red herring, because a lot of volunteering through organisations is actually informal and light touch, micro volunteering elements that you spoke about, Ed, and some of the things that are done as a collective mutual aid actually quite formal. So it becomes very challenging. Charles, you probably know about the big help out that's happening later this year, and they would talk about helping out and doing things in a more neighbourly manner. So there are lots of phrases that could be used, but I'd encourage us not to get too hung up on the different.
We're not getting bogged down in definitions. The point of the question was really just more to, you know, see whether it's all been captured, really. You know, whether they've captured everything, really, because it's so wide, really. If we use that wide definition.
And Ruth, if I could ask you a question, what's the name of your book? Is it called Volunteering?
I could put it in the link. It's called Volunteer Involvement Theory, and I'll put a link in the chat if that's not taking up too much.
Yeah,
Super.
Are there any more questions in terms of what Ed has said?
Alan's raised his hand.
Yeah, hi Ed. I've got a question about the trade-off between volunteering and performance. I've been involved in a number of volunteer-based organizations where you're kind of really grateful for people giving their time. And the question is that enough? And sometimes it feels like it is, and other times it feels like it's not. And it just seems fraught with challenges generally because you're beholden to people for their time, kind of. And so, to what extent can you expect higher standards than they might be offering?
Yes, that's such a good question, Alan. And I think, let's start with the idea of rigor. Is it, what are we trying to achieve? And see that as a way of holding to account the way that we operate in relation to that. It is a weakness of the voluntary sector that performance and good performance tends to be regarded as doing better than last year. I'm doing work with one charity at the moment that saw a significant dip in their income over the COVID period. They had to kind of axe their youth services and the like. And their strategy for the moment is to get back to the income level they had in 2020. And you kind of think, okay, that's not the most values framed mission that is there. But in particular, kind of the idea of optimality is the idea of, are we doing things in the best possible way to achieve what we are trying to achieve? And it's so easy for the performance benchmark simply being, well, are we better than we were before, rather than that real rigor of, are we doing things in the best possible way? And if you can have that conversation, then the question of, are there trade-offs? So, well, somebody is not going to be able to give the time or the skills to be able to do it. So, what compromises do we make? Can perhaps be made in a more open way rather than being taken as assumed. But again, it's a real weakness of the voluntary sector model. And, the voluntary sector is called the voluntary sector because, all charities are run by volunteers. The trustees, with a tiny number of exceptions, are all volunteers. So even when you get very large charities that are, paying staff and doing all kinds of great work, there's still voluntarism at their heart. But the weakness of the model typically is a lack of accountability, because trustees choose the next set of trustees for most. And you do get problems, like trustees choose other trustees that are a bit like them, or they choose trustees that don't have the right level of ambition necessarily that is, required really to live up to the mission. Or you have trustees that, run scared and won't take the risks. Charities are there to take risks. They're there to take risks in order that the beneficiaries they're working for have better lives. And there's a kind of rather infantile debate around charities. They just shouldn't take risks. They should safeguard the charity. Whereas actually should be safeguarding the mission. Charities should be taking risks. And many trustees are just too conservative to do that. So it's not perfect, but then, there's no perfect organizational model, but they are things to be aware of. And I think what you talked about there in terms of a sort of a challenge in terms of complicity around not doing enough or not being enough is a lack of culture that is open to understanding in a clear and deliberative way what those trade-offs might be and how you find your way forward. Thanks, Alan.
Neil, David Clifton's got his hand up.
Okay.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Ed. Fantastic session. Really, really insightful. Fantastic. Two thoughts, comments that really sprung to mind firstly, and I'll just frame them. And the first one is around the human-centric motivations and desires for connection, meaning and belonging. Where did that fit in the motivational models? And also, does that also span naturally, not just into the voluntary sector, informal, formal, but also into the public sector and also into private sector if done well? So that was one sort of thought and comment leading from the fantastic conversation. The second one, foundationally, was this element of, you know, the foundational structures that were presented, which I again found great. For me, I was sort of thinking about, well, actually, the thing that becomes more foundational perhaps is time rather than money. And perhaps, you know, and is there any comments about how time is more foundational, because that will support how we do parenting, how we do faith work, how we do volunteering informally. Likewise, how it flows into charitable, more formal environments of work and public sector work and private sector work. So just thought, you know, just asking, you know, perhaps any thoughts on those two areas would be really, really good.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, kind of big thinking, big thoughts here. Time, that I think the kind of the great example on time and volunteering is the work of the late friend of mine, Edgar Kahn, who developed the model of time banking or time dollars in the States. And that's a model of supporting volunteering, which recognizes people's time for every hour they spend is worth one time dollar. So there's a kind of an equity and an equality to people's time there, which is at the heart of the model, which is essentially a mutual cooperative model in terms of the reciprocity that, you know, is at work. So I think it is, you know, time can be a great way of looking at it. And I'm sure that, you know, and Ruth might have views on this, but I'm sure that, you know, understanding the pressures and the space and the use of time, you know, in a modern society and economy is at the core of understanding, you know, where volunteering is being squeezed or where some of those, you know, those trends are going. I've argued, I mean, the big help out which Ruth mentioned is a really good example of actually trying to freshen up volunteering and represent it, not using the volunteering word, because for some people actually that triggers things that's not really for the likes of me, but helping out is a much more kind of open way. But in a lot of other areas like public health or environmental behaviors, there's a recognition that actually you need patient, long-term social marketing to be able to support the right public behaviors on these. You can't just get people to stop smoking. Actually, you need a social marketing public health campaign over time to be able to do that, that's considered. And I think we need the same in the volunteering space. And actually, I think there's, you know, there's too much lip service paid to volunteering and not enough investment in the core infrastructure, particularly at a national level, that, you know, we need to value it as a society and see where we need to pump prime it. And then the belonging and meaning, it the work that Johnston and Richard did was using the framework of incentives, because they were coming from an economics background and trying to widen the purview of economics. But of course, incentives and motivation feed directly into questions of identity and belonging. And again, I think that question of belonging is a really interesting one in terms of, again, that interplay between the individual and the institutional. So it's that the great example in sort of behavioral economics of the childcare nursery that started to ask people to pay fines if they were late to pick up their children. And what they found was that more parents were late to pick up their children because they thought, oh, well, I'll just pay the fine. And they saw it as a commercial transaction rather than a moral responsibility for them to play their part in, hard-pressed staff getting away on time. So it's a little bit about that sort of sense of identity as well, which is, we're told that we live in a market economy. All the newspapers and press talk about GDP and all of that. And therefore, that's how we begin to behave. And I think that's a real paradox that, the economics textbooks are wrong because they simplify things. But then they encourage us to behave as if the economics textbooks were right, because that's what's validated in all of the kind of, the media and life more widely. As you can see, I'm going off on one, and I will stop. David?
No, I don't think you're going off on one at all. It all comes down to an understanding of human psychology and the assumption that we never must make that humans behave rationally. Because processes that are designed, products that are designed, continually miss the mark because they just assume we all act as a herd, and that's really the nature of the beast. Are there any more questions for Ed before we move on? Just to do a little bit of work ourselves.
I spotted a hand being raised by Alan.
Okay.
Thanks, Charles and Neil. Ed, you mentioned time. And this might be controversial, but I'm thinking, I wonder how much of a red herring time is in the volunteering space, because at the end of the day, it's not about the amount of time that people put in, it's about the impact that they can have. And I'm reminded of when the tsunami happened, we were in the pub, a few of us, and we decided that we wanted to do something. And somebody said, oh, well, let's do a bake sale. Ask everybody in the village to make a cake and sell it for 50 pence a slice. And I'm like, no, please don't do that. What a waste of time. And what we ended up doing was creating a model where the tennis club and the cricket club played a football match against each other, where each player had to be sponsored for a minimum of £100. And then we had other activities around the match, and we raised something like £5,000. Now, that far outweighed what would have been done by a few cake slices being sold. So I'm just wondering whether time is a kind of a bit of a red herring and not allowing us to think about impact.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, Alan. And I think joining the dots to impact can be difficult because it's a complex world, and it's easy to assume that the money that we raise to save the donkey saves the donkey, and and everything gets better. We don't know that, and in some ways charities, it's in their interest to tell you that it is that simple. It may not be volunteering, maybe kind of a donation or the like, and it is hard living in a complex world. And I think you're absolutely right that the motivation is to make a difference. If it took, Charles's example of helping somebody across the road, the impact is helping them across the road, and the pleasure of having done that, not in spending an hour crossing the road to do it or the like. So yes, I think it's a really interesting thought there as well. And I've got, if I could add, I mean, David, I'll come to you, but I just wonder if it's all right as a closing word on the link between volunteering and well-being, which is one thing which I haven't touched on, but is a fascinating area for research at the moment. David?
Yes, I just wanted to build on what Alan said, and really, how I see that and linking to that is obviously looking at the purposeful use of time. Rather than just time, we're talking about the purposeful use of time, and obviously Alan's example is a great example where we can more purposefully use that time. So it's not just any time, because any time can just send you off in a million directions and achieve nothing. It's a purposeful use of time that is a more collaborative, cooperative and more intelligent approach to use of time that creates a far more impact. So, you know, Alan's was a good example, and I just wanted to add that. So, yeah.
Super. Again, thanks, Ruth, for that link. And I can't remember a source for this, but you know, kind of, I think it's quite a beautiful fact that I was once told that why do people volunteer? The most common reason is because somebody asked them to. I just think that's lovely. Absolutely, kind of, you know, lovely. Now, on the well-being element, there was a really fascinating piece of research out a kind of a year plus or more ago from the Oxford Centre for Wellbeing, which is having a look at all the different things that companies do to promote well-being amongst their staff. And there's very proven, you know, impacts. If you've got happier staff, they're more likely to stay, they're more likely to be productive, they're more likely to trust others and be innovative, and so on. So quite an interest in, you know, happy workplaces and in staff well-being. And what the research showed, which was a kind of a meta research of all the different primary research in the field, is that there was only one initiative that businesses were taking that actually had a positive impact on well-being. Everything else either had a zero impact on well-being, or quite often it had a negative impact on well-being. So, for example, you know, organizing time management courses to help people, you know, reduce the stress of time management, back to that question, in work, actually makes people more stressed. But all the rest of the things, you know, bring your dog to work, you know, sort of massage, tai chi, you know, pool tables and the like, none of these contributed to staff wellbeing except for this one element, which was volunteering, where staff employees are encouraged or enabled to take up voluntary roles. And the research is really interesting on why this makes a difference, because it's something that is of collective values and is seen as authentic. And the difference that it makes to us to be able to make a difference to the lives of others. And I'll just close on the words, which I still find inspiring, of my former chair at Pilotlight, Sally Bailey, someone who has struggled with disabilities over her life. And she said that if I ever feel helpless, I help somebody else. And in that act of volunteering, she finds purpose, she finds agency, she finds herself, and she finds a way forward. And that is the extraordinary opportunity that volunteering can give. Now I'm going to kind of pass on to a next section, which is going to be about you and volunteering and what you're involved in and the like. I apologize to have to step out myself because I'm heading over to the RUS, the Community Land Trust, to meet some potential investors in our volunteering project. So I hope that's a reasonable excuse. Been such a joy to be part of the Alliance kind of meet up. Looking forward to the World Values Day, and lovely to meet some of you for the first time and to see old friends that I know from before.
Thanks so much, Ed.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And a great reason to leave this volunteering meeting, after all. So.
Cheers, Ed. Thank you.
So let's move it on. As Ed says, this is your chance to get involved, and he's provided great context for the remaining sort of 20 minutes that we have together today. And I think what will be useful in terms of trying to consider volunteering is to take it down to a sort of personal level, and to establish a close link between personal values that we have and those that we might use or we feel are connected, motivational to our own volunteering. So I was going to ask us to maybe think about a sort of value that means something to us and can be linked to a use within volunteering. And then after I've had a minute or so for you to do that, we're going to go into some groups.
Shall we do that or stay in the same room, do you think, Neil? We've got a reduced amount of time.
I don't mind. What do people think?
Adam, what do you say? Stay in the same, all in the same room?
Yeah, sure. I mean, 20 minutes is enough.
I'm really happy to stay in the same room.
Whatever you like.
So let's all stay in the same room, which is great. And then really to have a minute to think about the personal value that obviously is personal to us, and then have a discussion in terms of how we might use that in volunteering. And then there's two other questions after that, but I suspect in the time we've got, we may only have time to consider one. So if we can all just take a minute to think about a personal value that we relate to and how we might use that within a volunteering context, and then we'll open up the conversation to discuss that as one single group. So if you'd like to take a minute to do that, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So I'm sure I hope that's given everyone enough time to think about that. Would anyone like to start and be bold enough to talk about the value that's important to them in the context of volunteering and how it might help? Who'd like to start?
Yeah, I can go, Neil. It's pretty easy for me actually, because one of my 5 core values is kindness, and the reason I'm in Florida is to do planning for a kindness summit that we have in May, which is being attended by a leadership group of kindness representatives from some of the largest organizations in the world. 2-day program, one for business leaders and one for the community. And it's all volunteered, so job done.
Perfect prompt for you, Alan.
Yeah, that's right.
Another beautiful plug.
I've even put the flyer for the event where you can register in the chat.
And what impact does that have on you, apart from the fact that you've been motivated to fly to? Did you say you were in Florida?
Yeah.
Because is that in itself an example of how you've been motivated by that value to volunteer for this summit? So it's pushed you to take quite a lot of action, hasn't it? Because not everyone would fly to Florida to follow that value.
Yeah, I think it's this, when you follow your values, it actually helps you to just follow the energy, I suppose. And a plan, I found this is a perfect case in point. A plan is not necessarily needed. And in fact, some of the things that have happened could not possibly have been planned, but it has taken a large degree of faith, I suppose, and courage. But you get that when you know that you're living in alignment with your values. The output is not necessarily known, but sometimes magic happens.
So the key phrase I got that from is following the energy, which I think is quite apt. Does anyone want to contribute from what Alan's just said there?
I'm going to build on kind, because one of my mantras, which I suppose is linked to value, is kind curiosity. So that element of kindness being really important, but also maybe it is a following the energy, that curiosity in how things develop, how people think differently, and then bringing that together to build connections of people and ideas. I think that's part of what drives me to be thinking both about being a volunteer and of involving volunteers. So that, I think that's linked to that following that energy piece, and possibly building on a desire to fly to Florida to do something that's important, is almost that element of agency and tying into your own human agency to be able to make a difference.
Can you think of a specific example that can bring that to life for us a bit more, Ruth, in your own? I mean, Alan's hopped on a plane. He's sort of spoilt it for us all in terms of thought and action, hasn't he? But
That's a bit harsh.
no, I didn't mean. Well, I was trying to big you up as a huge example, Alan. Such a positive example. If you can't think of anything, Ruth, no worries.
Thomas is wanting to. He's waving his hand.
Yeah.
I really like kindness, and what I've done in Stockholm, Sweden, I've written down small tickets, 250 ones. And when I meet people, when I am in a bus and the person, and I'm standing up and there is a person who is actually giving me his place, I take this ticket and tell the person, "You are a kind one." And all these tickets to different persons in the society, when I meet with the people, they are so happy to have this reaction from me. But I only give it to people who are really kind. But when I do it, the other day I gave it to a woman in a shop, and she said, "Well, you say I'm kind. That's what I was needed. I needed that kind of reaction."
Thomas, you're not going to tell us about the lady that kissed you?
No. Yeah, the other one kissed me. There were two women.
That's a very different type of ticket you give out for those ones.
Yeah, I have a small ticket with saying, "You are kind. Continue to do that." And that's what I give to these people, and it gives a lot of good reactions, actually. It's a small thing, but it works.
But it's also about following, and in this case, creating the energy that Alan was referencing. You're allowing people to react in that way by what you've done. Whereas if you just walked by them, that interaction, that energy wouldn't have been created. I think that's quite interesting. Would anyone else like to volunteer if they have any thoughts?
Can I just say a word? Because
Very well, Charles.
I'm not quite sure what the value attached to this is, but my earliest memory of volunteering, and it actually echoes something that Ed said just before we finished, was when I was a kid and at home, and probably in the school holidays and nodding around complaining of being bored or didn't know what to do. My mother would say to me, "Stop that and just get up and go and do something useful for someone." And so that became that I thought was a very effective way of sort of getting one into the volunteering mode. I wasn't really volunteer because my mother said, "Go and do something useful for someone," but it was a very, very good advice, really. And in a way, I think if one can get into the habit of doing something useful for other people, that's really what volunteering is all about. And the value, I guess, my my top value is love. And I think, all the volunteering, I like Ed's idea of the love economy, the first chart he showed with the research. And I think that that's what motivates love is behind so many of the other values too. It's really what motivates us to volunteer. And if it doesn't at first, if we're doing it for those extrinsic reasons of trying to sort of get experience in the world and dress up one's CV or whatever else it is, become more socially at ease with people. But even if one starts with perhaps slightly selfish motivation, like not incurring one's mother's irritation, it develops into, because it's an experience which does give back, it makes one feel good about oneself. It makes one feel, the feeling of doing good for someone else, as we all know, and research now verifies, the feeling of doing good for someone, doing something kind for other people, does give one this feeling of good. It prompts hormones to circulate and lights up those frontal lobes. So and this can become it's something that one gets used to and possibly even addicted to. You feel better about yourself doing it.
So in the sense of actually creating a really positive and good habit.
Exactly. Yeah.
I must admit, my own experience, one of my neighbours here was stuck in Doha, was able to fly home yesterday after being stuck in the Doha for 2.5 weeks. And before she came home, this is only a really small example, because I was looking after one of her dogs, I made sure, her kitchen was full, had some fresh bread, some eggs, some milk, and all the rest of things. So I know that she, because she's on her own, was really grateful for that act. But for me, it was just a question of, in this local store, just buying an extra loaf of bread and an extra. And I do think this idea about creating this energy, whether you volunteer for, a officially recognized charity or you do it in a small size, is something that I think is good, very good to talk about. Because from my perspective, I don't think it matters why you're necessarily, what makes you want to volunteer, just as long as the output, which is really what Alan was talking about when he was talking about raising, the football match, which raised a significant amount of cash, is on the money, because sometimes it is about being a little bit more practical in terms of what you're going to do to try to maximize the impact of that collective effort. Does anyone else have any more?
David's got his hand raised.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant conversations again. And the thing that came to my mind, linking to kindness, I was at an AI summit, interestingly, about AI with values, and people couldn't get in the room. It was a massive event, people couldn't get in the room. I managed to create some space for a person to come and join me. And just from that little act, he then went on to LinkedIn, took the time to post and said, this guy has just brilliantly done this. And it's just representing the values we should all have. So it's just just a small act of kindness. I never expected that for a minute, but it's just a strange thing from just a small act of kindness for someone, how actually it rippled in to an audience who were all about applying AI with values. The thing I really wanted to say was, with my comment, was around, which links to kindness, which is about making a meaningful difference, and this element of belonging, which I referred to earlier. And I think about a number of volunteering things I've done: cleaning the streets, looking after, supporting the River and Canal Trust, supporting the Scouts groups, being a chair of governors, lots of different things. But the interesting one that gives me the most value and the most value from doing it, and the one I kept doing the longest, or would, really, is the one where I had more a belonging to it. The ones which were individual, just go clean the streets, which had no element of community belonging. I didn't get much from that. Is through the coming together with others to do things in the meaningful things. And the one that stood out there was Scouts group, for instance, seeing young people come in who were the most nervous people. And then actually 8 years later, they become Scout leaders themselves. That transformation you see within the people through people coming together to support people, you know, for me, that's almost priceless. So that belonging element and making a meaningful difference really is what gets me out of bed to do it, if that makes sense. So that was just my thoughts to you answer your question.
So again, that's reinforcing the point that Alan made, that if you can get the right task, then that really is very significant when you're trying to get people to volunteer. We haven't got very much time left. I just wonder whether it would be relevant to ask the room about what people think stops people from volunteering. Because I suspect that what the figures will show is that the same people in communities volunteer time and time again. And I wonder, to one of the points that Ed makes, he was talking about how you can grow the pool of people who would like to volunteer. So maybe I could just throw that open to the room before we close. If anyone's got any ideas and thoughts to share about what they feel stops people from volunteering, stops people from wanting, as people have mentioned today, wanting to make a difference. Can I throw that open?
Can I just build on what I just said?
Yeah, sure.
My experiences from all of the things I was just describing is when there's no element of belonging to the work.
Okay.
Then that stops people coming in. And I know a number of people have explicitly said that. They'll go and clean streets, but they won't do it as part of just isolated activity. They want to be part of sort of groups doing it. So there's a collective component to it, not just you just look after this, adopt this street and do it for yourself, and you never see anybody or connect with anybody. That has limited capabilities, and people tend to less desire to get involved in that sort of thing.
Does anyone ever, very quickly, does anyone else have any other thoughts to add to that?
I think that lack of belonging is very important. I think people don't feel they belong. They don't identify with that community. They're happy to help themselves, their families, maybe. But if they don't feel a sense that they belong to a particular community, for instance, the local community, or it could be other communities, then they're not going to be motivated to do it, rightly or wrongly. I mean, it's sad, because this is exactly the sort of behaviour which builds a feeling of community.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the clock. So can I ask, because our session is nearly over, but I would really like to hand over to Alan to try to make sense of what people have heard today. And thank you before I hand over to him, to everyone who's participated so willingly. It's been really lovely to see everyone today. Alan, can I hand over to you to make a few closing remarks, please?
Yeah, for sure. I'll volunteer to do that. I think the headline is about the importance, impact, and potential of volunteering. That's come through really strongly from the beginning and then through the onward conversation. And then just a few kind of headlines points. First, the need for an infrastructure to encourage volunteering rather than just relying on individual goodwill. The delicate kind of push-pull nature of the relationship between economics and volunteering. So sensitive, but probably economics has a necessary part to play. So the question perhaps is, how can that relationship be at its best? A phrase that I've used before, but volunteering unveils your values. So when you remove extrinsic reward, what you're left with is something that shows you what you really care about. And finally, this notion of volunteering being an energy generator, which I think is a great point to end on, Neil. And maybe a request, if you fancy volunteering and joining the UK Values Alliance, we'd love to have you join us.